Good evening from Washington. I'm Larry O'Connor, and we're gearing up now for this Wednesday's presidential debate of Republican candidates for the nomination, except for one. That would be Donald Trump. He won't be there. He'll be giving an exclusive interview to Tucker Carlson that night for some counter-programming. But the debate is important to the American electorate, and Salem News Channel will be covering it live on the scene. I'll be there, and we'll also have full coverage from Michael Gallagher, Andrew Wilkow. Make sure you tune in Wednesday night here to Salem News Channel. Joining us right now is Hogan Gidley, former National Press Secretary for President Trump and also from the 2020 presidential campaign. And he's the Vice Chair of the Center for Election Integrity. Hogan, good to see you again, sir.
Great to see you, Larry. Thanks for the time.
Well, first of all, President Trump's announcement that not only this debate, but he will not be attending any of the debates. And I understand that seems to be a wise political calculation. He's ahead by, what, 45 points now. And being on the stage could only hurt him, I suppose. So this is the smart move?
It is. If I were advising Donald Trump or his campaign, and I'm not, but if I were, they asked, I would tell them absolutely not. Under no circumstance should you step on that stage. There's a time and a place to talk to voters, and debates are a good place to do that. But this guy's up 45, 50 points. And the fact is, you'll just be a punching bag, a piñata for the rest of the crowd to kind of take shots at you and tear you down. You are the front runner by a large margin. And look, if you're high in the polls, you don't want to debate. If you're low in the polls, you always want to debate, because debates are about creating moments. They're about carving out a niche. Remember, Kamala Harris had a brief moment in that presidential debate where she called Joe Biden a segregationist and a sex criminal.
Right.
But I digress.
I forgot about that.
Had the T-shirts ready, and then within a week, she'd petered out. So this happens all the time where people try and create those moments. This is a whole different set of scenarios, though, because you have a former president also running for re-election at the top of the polling.
Yeah.
So why would the person be on stage? I would imagine if you're going to get to Donald Trump, you have to climb that ladder, and it's one rung at a time. And so you're going to have to try and chip it away at those who are ahead of you to get into a room where you can actually be mano a mano with Donald Trump. And so it's going to take a while. It's going to take some maneuvering, but this is the first in the long line of a series of debates. And I imagine Donald Trump will debate closer to time.
Oh, all right. Well, because his announcement was he will not do any of the debates, but that would be if it gets down to one or two. Because here's the thing, two responses to that. The first is just because he's not there doesn't mean he's not going to be a punching bag. Of course they're going to go after Donald Trump. The difference is he won't be there to respond. Is there a danger to that for him?
There's somewhat of a danger, but remember, the thread that all of these, or the needle that all these candidates are trying to thread is, I'm Donald Trump's policies without his personality.
Yeah.
And if you attack him to hurt him, then the base is not going to be too happy with you, and the chances of you securing his votes are really null and void. You don't have that opportunity. Remember when Chris Christie to Marco Rubio did the best murder-suicide ever in politics on a debate stage, where he took Rubio out, but he got none of the votes.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people, I think like Chris Christie, don't care about getting Donald Trump supporters. They just want to hurt Donald Trump. But if you do that, you're going to need those supporters he has to move forward, move up, and actually secure the nomination. And remember, everybody on that stage is saying, hey, if you elect me, I promise I'll do what Donald Trump did policy-wise. That may be true, but with the disaster this country is facing right now and how bad Joe Biden has been, do you really want to risk our future on a promise as opposed to someone with a proven record? That's going to be Donald Trump's message, and obviously everyone else is going to have the opposite message.
Hogan, if I could ask you to put your former National Press Secretary hat on for a moment. I mean, you did a yeoman's job during the Trump administration, standing there in the White House, in the briefing room, talking to the media, talking to the press reporters. You look at this news cycle that President Biden has had in the last 2 weeks, from the disastrous fires in Maui and apparently inept reaction on the ground by the Maui government, as well as a very slow response from the federal government. Joe Biden sitting at the beach during the whole thing. Plus, you've got the revelation that he's using a pseudonym to hide his emails when he was vice president, and those very emails copied Hunter Biden, Devon Archer, and were about business in Ukraine, where his son and his family was making millions of dollars. I gotta think pressure would be on you if this were President Trump and all these things were going on. Have you noticed? The media is silent about these things, Hogan.
Of course, and the polls have Donald Trump ahead of Joe Biden nationally in a lot of ways, but think about if the press were honest. Think about if the press were actually curious and asked some of the questions you're pointing out right now and reported on the fact that Hunter Biden and Joe Biden potentially, were involved in some bribery scheme, my goodness, he'd be up by 20 points at this point. Understand, from June 8th to July 18th, research shows 527 minutes dedicated to Donald Trump and indictments, and zero, a big goose egg, dedicated to Hunter Biden and Joe Biden's problems. That's always the uphill battle that the Republicans are going to face. It's unfair, but that's part of the game. That's what made Donald Trump so dangerous, is he used Twitter and other social media platforms without the filter of the mainstream media to give you the message directly, hearing exactly what a president of the United States was thinking at any given moment. Sometimes that was a great thing to have. Sometimes it was more difficult than others. But the fact is, you got to see what was on his mind. The press has been derelict in their duty here for decades in this country. There's a reason their popularity sits somewhere between Congress and COVID. It's because they lie to us consistently. And it's not just about who they prosecute in the media. It's about who they protect. And we have seen a full-scale circling of the wagons around Hunter Biden and Joe Biden. Remember, in that briefing room, we had one or two folks who would ask good questions to the White House. Everybody else was against us. Now it's the exact opposite. Karine Jean-Pierre is the national press secretary, of course, for the Biden administration. But everybody else in that room acts as though they're her deputies, just parroting whatever the administration says without question. And that's a real problem, I think, for the American people.
Popularity between COVID and Congress. I like that. Although, to be honest, Hogan, I watched a little Morning Joe the other day. COVID's looking pretty good right now. Quickly, I know that, yeah, you worked with President Trump, and obviously you're a loyal guy, and he values loyalty, although you are not working on the 2024 campaign. Setting Trump aside for a minute, so far, who's impressing you from this field? You're a comms guy. Who's good at cutting through and communicating and sort of getting their message out?
Look, I think we have a pretty talented field right now. Vivek is obviously kind of the flavor of the month. I don't say that in a negative way. I say that because in these campaigns, typically you have a front runner, and then you have people who kind of raise and lower and go up and go down, and the scrutiny hits them, and then they fall down a few pegs, and someone else steps in. Happened with Santorum and myself in 2012, of course. Look, I think he's hitting all the marks right now. Vivek is defending Donald Trump as he should, but he's also coming forth with his own policy prescriptions. Some of them aren't necessarily popular, but he's trying to kind of cut against the mainstream. And he's doing a pretty good job of that right now, quite frankly. And he has the ability to talk to the high-minded elite crowd with his language and his way of explaining things. Mm-hmm. But then he can go into Iowa at the state fair and talk to the common man, explain to them what he wants to do too, with good simple language and strategy, just like Donald Trump was able to do. He's someone I think you should watch. Tim Scott, my senator from South Carolina, obviously love him too. Yeah. And we'll see where he goes. Those are two I'd keep an eye on. Nikki has an opportunity there, but I think Tim Scott's probably going to beat her in his own home state. But we have just such a talented field right now that it's hard not to see them as so much better than the bench the Democrats have, which is basically Kamala Harris and Pothole Pete. That's all they got.
So no Asa fever for you yet, Hogan Gidley. All right, well, we'll keep an eye.
The draft Asa movement seems to not be coalescing around him as though we thought they would.
Maybe they thought ASA stood for something else. Hogan Gidley, thanks for joining us. We'll be back. More to come on O'Connor Today. We have been spending a lot of time tonight talking about this Wednesday's presidential debate between the Republican candidates for the nomination, except for one. And I want to make sure that you don't miss Salem's coverage of that debate, including yours truly live on the ground in Milwaukee. There's a lot going on, and we got you covered. And one thing I'm really hoping for from this debate, a very serious and robust discussion of the top national security issue this nation faces, and that is the China dilemma. Joining us right now is a man who every single one of these candidates should be talking to and getting briefed by. He is Gordon Chang. Follow him on Twitter, Gordon G. Chang. First of all, Gordon, are the candidates talking to you? Have you heard from? You don't have to name names, but I'm hoping that they're picking your brain.
No, they're not, Larry, but they know what I have to say about it because we're very clear. So I'm not surprised. I mean, especially at an early stage right now.
I suppose. It is curious, though. Well, this weekend, there was a big, and by the way, you're an expert on the entire Pacific Rim and our national security and diplomatic efforts with all of Asia. So I'm interested in your reaction to this Camp David summit. I don't know where it came from, where we have peace in our time finally between South Korea and Japan. I didn't realize there were such hostilities between those two nations. What was this all about?
Well, first of all, I think it was about China, because China is driving both South Korea and Japan together. Japan, at the beginning of the 20th century, actually not only colonized Korea, but obliterated the Korean nation.
Yeah.
And Koreans haven't forgotten that. Whether one is a progressive or a conservative, Koreans have seen Japan almost as the enemy, even though Japan is important to the defense of South Korea. So Yoon Suk-yeol, the new conservative president of South Korea, to great political risk to himself, has reached out to Japan, and that has really been important. He's been a statesman, and I think that has largely driven this. President Biden, who believes in alliances, certainly has tried to knit together our friends in the region. And so really what we have is China has actually driven old adversaries together.
And it's certainly the history of the Japanese atrocities, you're right, from the beginning of the 20th century all through World War II and the horrific treatment of the so-called comfort women. Just horrible, horrible history. But setting those animosities aside, and they're decades old, they've had diplomatic ties. They have had economic ties, these two countries, haven't they?
Yes, they have. You know, the United States and Japan are military allies. We have an obligation to defend each other. We have a similar relationship with South Korea, a treaty, but South Korea and Japan are not allies.
I see.
And over the course of decades, the United States has tried to change what's called a hub and spoke relationship into something more of a web to get Japan and South Korea to cooperate. And we haven't been extremely successful in that regard, except what's happened is, first of all, the North Koreans and the Chinese are scaring South Korea, but also Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which the Japanese see as Chinese fueled, that has gotten the Japanese to spend a lot more on their defense. So really, it has been a process that's been driven by Beijing. And what the United States has done is facilitated that with that Camp David meeting, which really was historic in so many different ways.
So, Gordon, does this mean that we're looking at potentially a military alliance that would almost act as a mini Asian NATO should China make military aggressive overtures toward Taiwan? In other words, you invade Taiwan, that means Korea, Japan, the U.S. all work together.
First of all, I don't think Japan and South Korea will ever form a formal military alliance with obligations to defend each other. But they are working much more closely together. And there were 3 documents that came out of that Camp David meeting. What's going to happen, I think, Japan is going to defend Taiwan for a lot of reasons. South Korea probably won't. But that's almost academic, Larry. Because
can I jump in? China, is that because of the alliance between North Korea and China, and that their existential threat is so close across the 38th parallel?
Yeah, we forget that China and North Korea are each other's only military ally. Because China will lean on North Korea to invade Japan or South Korea. So when things go bad over Taiwan, I think the whole region is plunged into war for various reasons. And it's not just the Chinese and North Koreans, it's also the Russians. The Russians will get involved as well. And so it will be a big fight to the finish in East Asia.
So, you know, speaking of China and Russia and their newfound brotherhood, which, geez, thanks a lot, guys. You know, one thing we had going for us is that both China and Russia were sort of had some animosity. Now they seem to be pals. Their interest lies well beyond their borders like Ukraine and Taiwan. What is their interest in the southern African nations right now during this, what's it called, the BRICS summit?
Yeah, the BRICS is a grouping of countries that are from the global south, one could say. And they really have very little in common, except that a Goldman Sachs analyst a long time ago put together the 4 countries, BRIC, and South Africa has joined. So that's Brazil, Russia, India, and China. and now South Africa. They're having a summit. It comes at a very interesting time because Putin will not be there in person for, I think, a number of reasons. Xi Jinping is going to South Africa, but he's presiding over a country that's falling apart internally. So I don't think that he'll be the force that he normally would be. And what's going to be interesting will be the India-China meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping. Because I think China needs to cool down relationships with India because he's fighting a multi-front war. And I think he probably wants to get the Indians off his back for a little while.
For the American interests, in terms of our economic issues, everyone says that what's really driving our lack of seriousness toward the threat of China is our dependence on them for cheap manufacturing, et cetera. Is India the solution there? Is India the real rising global giant potentially there in terms of accommodating America's manufacturing and economic needs if, in fact, we turn it off with China?
Potentially. It's Brazil is a country that has always had a lot of potential but not realized it. India under Prime Minister Modi is actually making some progress in terms of becoming a good friend of the West. But there's also been some backsliding as well, and that's over the war in Ukraine. What's happening right now with regard to U.S. supply chains in China is that Xi Jinping has been pushing foreign companies out of China. It's not so much that we're dependent on them that has affected our policy. It's really Xi Jinping has been driving this process. And while Biden has been dog whistling American companies to stay in China, they're just not doing it.
Gordon, back to the BRICS summit here, because it appears as though, and I think it's fascinating, I didn't know the origins here was Goldman Sachs figuring out that Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa, and China could be some sort of alliance. We now have 20 other countries asking to join that alliance, all separate from the United States. Of course, the United States is usually the driving factor in the G7, G10, G20, what have you, as well as NATO military alliance. Is this potentially a real rising threat to U.S. economic dominance by cobbling these countries together and them setting their own agendas outside of the U.S.'s influence?
I don't think so. And the reason is that if you look at the 5 BRICS countries right now, China wants to break apart India. Russia is a pariah. China's falling apart. Brazil is sort of like a bystander to watching all of this. They still need the U.S. market that is really driving things. And if you look at just the world in general, the United States, for all our troubles, is becoming relatively stronger. And so this is, I think, in a sense, a good story for the U.S. It's just that right now we have leadership that is not recognizing the situation in the world. But the U.S. could be even a greater force for good, and also a much stronger country with different leadership. But even with Biden, we're relatively doing okay.
Huh. All right, Gordon Chang. Follow him on Twitter, Gordon G. Chang. And Gordon, let's hope Wednesday night at the debate we have at least one question that delves into any of the issues we've just covered in the last 10 minutes. Sadly, I don't have high hopes, but hopefully. Thank you, Gordon. There's more to come on O'Connor tonight. You know, the debate this Wednesday, that'll be the first of many as Republicans determine who their nominee will be for president. It's all leading up to, of course, the general election next year. But none of these debates, none of this talk, none of this analysis, none of the polls, none of the wrangling matters if you don't get people out to vote. And for years now, many Republicans have been saying, geez, the Democrats are so good at this early voting game and at voter registration, but I'm sure our people will show up on election day. And well, we've seen how that turns out the last couple of times. So what are we going to do about it? Well, we wanted to bring on the expert from the Republican National Committee who's really on the ground doing all the great strategizing for voter registration and getting out the vote and encouraging people to vote early and often and putting a plan together to vote. But I don't think they have anybody over there that's doing it. You know who is doing it? An individual voter who was fed up, and he just took to the streets and started doing it. That's what we all should be doing. He is Scott Pressler, activist and the founder of Early Vote Action PAC. Scott, you're always an inspiring conversation, so thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Larry, for having me.
And I know you don't want to, I don't mean to make you blush, but you really are doing what we thought the Republican National Committee should be doing, what we thought their mandate was. Do you have any support from them? Do you even hear from them?
Well, today is the 129th consecutive day that I have reached out to the chairwoman of the RNC without a response.
Yeah.
And I'm going to keep on reaching out, but you know what? I'm also not going to wait. I think it's important that we lead by example, and we're going to show the RNC what they should be doing, respectfully.
Well, let's talk about that. You just came from Wisconsin. The debate will be there this Wednesday, and obviously Wisconsin is incredibly important in the Electoral College map. It was part of President Trump's miraculous victory in 2016, and it needs to flip back to Republicans if they're going to win in 24. It's where this first debate is, and it's where the convention's going to be. So what were you doing in Wisconsin?
Well, Joe Biden in 2020, quote unquote, won the election by 20,000 votes. That's not a huge margin. And so, for example, I was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Milwaukee is basically the Fairfax of the state of Wisconsin. It's the Democrat underbelly.
Yeah.
And so what we were doing is I was having a letter writing party. We have a list of 2,000 new movers to Milwaukee County. That's 1/10 of what we need to win the election right there. So I got a group of volunteers. For 2 hours, we sat down and wrote handwritten letters welcoming these new movers to Milwaukee and welcoming them to register to vote and join us at mkegop.com. And just imagine if we had people across the state getting people registered to vote and making sure that they had a plan to vote next November to defeat Joe Biden. Wisconsin is 100% winnable.
You mentioned Fairfax. That, of course, is the county in Northern Virginia. It's adjacent to Washington, D.C., and it's dominated by Democrats. You mentioned that because you're from Virginia. So I'd love for you to comment on Governor Glenn Youngkin's efforts. He has gone all in. There's a midterm election this year. It's an off-year election, as Virginia often has, to try to flip the state Senate. What do you think of what Youngkin's strategy is? It sounds a lot like he's been talking to you.
Well, as you mentioned, in January of this year, I launched an organization called Early Vote Action. And it's my contention, humbly, that if Republicans wait to vote in November of 2024, then Joe Biden has already won re-election. And we saw this with Kari Lake, that machines went down on Election Day. We saw this in Pennsylvania, where we ran out of paper ballots on Election Day. We saw this in Reno, Washoe County, Nevada, where it snowed on Election Day. And a lot of those factors contributed to us not having the red tsunami that everybody predicted was going to happen. And so I'm calling for an all-of-the-above approach to voting. Yes, Election Day, but also early in-person, mail-in voting, absentee voting, and where legal in states like Nevada, ballot harvesting. And I'm so glad to see that Governor Glenn Youngkin is really spearheading this all-of-the-above approach, and he's created his own website. And not only that, but here's one thing that people need to understand. There are 45 days of early voting in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Why do I, as a Republican, want to give the Democrats a proverbial 45-day head start that they are and narrowing down by the precinct the amount of voters that they need, and we are wishing and hoping and praying that all of our people are going to turn out on one day.
Yeah.
So no, we need an all-of-the-above approach, and I firmly support Governor Youngkin's strategy.
It's so smart, and by the way, you listed those states where something happened coincidentally on Election Day, and that's the day Republicans tend to vote. Meanwhile, in Florida, where the weather was fine, it didn't snow, and the machines were functioning because they have a governor who knows what he's doing, and look what happened in Florida. When everything works, it's great for Republicans. But for people complaining about, Maricopa County and Fulton County and the corruption there, well, if we rely on Election Day, then we're sort of telling those people exactly what day to rig it, I guess.
Democrats vote for weeks. Republicans vote for 12 hours.
Yeah.
and wonder why we have a difficult time winning elections.
Scott Presler, how do you work or sort of push back against the typical Republican response, which is, I don't like early voting, we should just have one election day, all this stuff with ballot harvesting, that's corrupt. We Republicans, we're better than that. Even if the law says it's okay, we should stick with what we think is right, which is everyone show up on election day and vote on election day, no ballot harvesting, yada, yada, yada.
Well, look, I am always traveling constantly, and I'm never home on election day. So early in-person voting is perfect for me because I get to lock in my vote and I don't have to worry about Pete Buttigieg canceling my flight on election day. So I know that my vote has been locked in. And think about people who probably support Republicans. Police officers, firefighters, pilots, airline attendants, truckers, our military. These are all people that may not be home on election day, but have conservative values. Why do we want to limit the ability of our people to cast their votes and make sure that every vote counts? And that's my goal. I want to lock them in.
I would love to just remind everyone, if they don't know your story, because you were a big Obama supporter in your youth, right? If I remember right, you were a dog walker? Oh, no, help me out.
I want to make it very abundantly clear. I have always been a Republican.
Why
However,
did I think that? I thought, okay, go ahead.
Look, I know maybe I look like a Democrat. That's how I bring them in. But I understand the difference now between an America First Republican and a globalist Republican. And I think that is the biggest eye-opener. But yes, I graduated from George Mason, couldn't find a job, was a dog walker, worked at an elementary school. President Obama inspired me because I realized I was a part of the problem because I wasn't a part of the solution. And my first ever job was helping to elect now Governor Greg Abbott in the great state of Texas.
Oh, I see. So Barack Obama said, you know, if you don't like things that are going on in this country, you should get out there and do something about it. And Scott Presler said, you're right, I will do something. I'll help elect a Republican.
That's right. President Obama, thank you for creating me.
There it is. I knew there was an Obama connection there. But you really did. You just said, that's it. I'm done. I'm done complaining. I'm done whining. I'm done, you know, firing off a really nasty comment on a Facebook page. I'm actually going to hit the ground. And you've been doing it for many years now. And I'm not kidding. You are inspiring. And I hope, are you bringing a lot more people? How many people, when you show up to a city, you announce ahead of time, the crowds must be growing every time you come in?
It's humbling and it's inspiring and it's exciting. And I love hearing from people where they say, Scott, because of you, I ran for school board. I won my race. And now we have a conservative majority on that board. And I think the main message that I want to impart onto people is, look, I'm one guy. And if I can do it, you at home can do it. And I ask you, if you've ever felt anything in your heart, the desire to make a change, now is that time. So please step up and take action.
Yeah, well, it is inspiring. It's Early Vote Action Pack, and it's a real good example of what one person can do. And you're right. If we had a ton of Scott Preslers out there, it wouldn't even be a close election. And by the way, one other thing, mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, if your kid has a college degree and they're just dog walking or whatever, tell them about Scott Presler. Maybe they'll find something new to do with their life. Scott, thank you. Not that there's anything wrong with dog walking. I love walking dogs.
No, and real quickly, Larry, there are elections this November in Virginia statewide. To everybody that is watching, please make a plan to vote.
Yes.
If we Governor Glenn Youngkin 2 Senate seat pickups and hold the House of Delegates, we will have an entirely conservative legislature in Virginia. So please vote this November.
Yes, and that puts Virginia on the map for the presidential next year. Thank you, Scott. More to come on O'Connor Tonight. The latest out of Maui is, well, pretty horrific. I believe the death count is now up to about 115, but 1,000 people are still missing. 2 weeks after the fire, 1,000 people are missing. That's not good news. The president finally went there after hanging out at the beach and given a no comment when people would ask him if he had anything to say to comfort the people who were left behind in Maui. But just having a photo op doesn't do much. Obviously. A lot of questions are being asked about the government's response there, the lack of sirens, the lack of diverting water from streams to the reservoirs so there could be water to put out the fires. We need to figure it all out. But if you're a Democrat, if you're a left-wing activist, if you're a climate activist, you've already figured this out. You figured it out the second you saw that there was a fire. Obviously, this is because of climate change. Or is it global warming? I always forget what they're going with. Let's ask Daniel Turner. He's the executive director of Power of the Future. And Daniel, it is so sad that the second this story hit, all the usual suspects came out without knowing anything, saying this was obviously because of global warming, because of carbon emissions from your big bad oil companies over at Power of the Future.
Yeah, it's very frustrating that climate change has become this shield for government incompetence. And I don't know what caused the fires yet. I don't think anyone has definitively said, though there are lots of news reports coming out about known arsonists back in May, about sparking and problems with the electrical wires for the last couple of years. But all of that aside, we don't know what caused it. And we are mourning the loss of scores of human lives, fellow Americans. But to use climate change as the shield for government not doing its job is really frustrating, because government has a role in our society, and the amount of incompetence we see is extraordinary.
Well, and isn't it also true, it appears from initial reports, that because of the very same climate activists and environmental activists that say you can't own an SUV, they also say you can't clear brush and tear down trees and have some controlled burns in areas that are overgrown. And that actually contributes to the fuels and fires like these.
Absolutely. And there are reports of that coming out in Maui, how there were areas that they weren't allowed to clear, especially around power lines. But we see this all the time in California, right? When you look at the terrible California wildfires, somehow only centralized in California. You never see it in Western Nevada. You never see it in Southern Oregon, Southwest Idaho. It's only California. And what does Gavin Newsom do, the governor? He says, well, it's climate change. And now, like Pontius Pilate, he gets to wash his hands of the boring part of government, which is forest management. No one wants to be governor to manage forests. You want to be governor to talk about equity and abortion and guns and sexy issues, right? So the boring part of being the governor, which are things like grid maintenance and forest maintenance, they all get pushed aside, and then we just use climate change as the shield.
Yeah, and last I checked, I mean, it's not like Hawaii is this bastion of overdevelopment and you know, I mean, it's pretty pristine already. Environmentalists already have their way in Hawaii. So are we to believe that these fires and the high winds that accompanied them, that this was a one-off, that 100 years ago we didn't have high winds until people started driving gas guzzlers? That makes no logical sense.
It doesn't. And if you look at the reports of just the weather, the humidity, the dry, it was all fairly normal. Hawaii was having a fairly normal month of August. So there are no climate anomalies that you could pinpoint to. And that's why climate change becomes this ethereal and universal cover for everything. But again, it is very frustrating that government has a role in our society. It has jobs it has to do. It has infrastructure projects it has to be responsible for. And we seem to have government pivot from these to issues that get folks elected. And
of course, we conservatives, we don't like politicizing natural disasters like this and these horrible things. So we're sitting here, I want to mourn the, God forbid, possibly 1,000 people who have died from these fires. So we try to be respectful, and meanwhile, they have no shame. They jump right in there and they say, we got to have new laws against your SUVs, because they love politicizing these things.
And never let a climate crisis go to waste, or any crisis. But yeah, there's a lot of pressure on this president to declare an official climate emergency. And we have to be petrified of that. Just look at the COVID emergency. And when you declare a COVID emergency, you can tell people they can't go to church. You can tell people they can't leave their house. You can leave some stores open because they have big DC lobbyists, but you can close down mom and pop shops because they don't have DC lobbyists. And if the COVID emergencies were terrible, and they were, and we're barely coming out of them, what will the climate emergencies be if Biden is able to declare a climate emergency, especially when it comes to 2024 election and ballot box proceedings? Let's see what the protocols are in a climate emergency next November.
Yeah, and Daniel, people outside of DC might be rolling their eyes thinking, oh, nobody's going to do that. This is a very real thing that's being discussed in Democrat and in media circles, although that's redundant, where there is pressure on Joe Biden to call a climate emergency. Not only will that theoretically empower him unless he's challenged, and I hope he will be challenged quite a bit in the courts. It'll empower him to enact emergency measures very similar to what we saw during the COVID-19, except instead of Anthony Fauci, it'll be John Kerry calling the shots.
Exactly. And we'll see a whole series of protocols and can and cannot do's coming and stemming from this, all under the guise of it's for your own good, it's for the public health. And like we saw with COVID, the powerful ones will be exempted. Heck, Joe Biden went to Tahoe for the weekend. Why? Because he can. He doesn't care about his carbon footprint. He's never worried about not using Air Force One. So get ready for the climate emergencies, because they will be draconian and ruthless, especially as we get closer to the presidential election.
It's also, by the way, you're right, this is all about the presidential election. It's a cynical political ploy, because when Republicans object, when members of the House majority actually try to block that move and challenge the president, they've got their talking point. They've got their issue. Look, the Republicans are science deniers, and they're denying that there's climate change and global warming. Even for those Republicans who think there may be an issue there, that doesn't mean you hand over control to the executive branch of government.
No, and it's the same playbook that they'll use for climate as they did use for COVID. They'll deplatform folks who say the wrong things about. Heck, there are certain platforms I can't say exactly what I believe about climate or energy, because I will be flagged as misinformation or disinformation. So the room for debate is absolutely gone. And then shows like yours will be targeted for spreading climate misinformation, and nothing is more threatening than that. It was so advantageous to the powerful, to those who desire power, what they did during COVID, that they'll never give up that power. They'll use climate next. They'll use any crisis to just glom onto power, take away your property, take away your freedom, and have absolute control.
Real fast, we only have a minute left, but I mean, at Power of the Future, Daniel, you actually are in contact, I'm guessing, with some of the executives at these oil and gas companies. There was a time there where they tried to play nice with these radicals, when they tried to sort of think that they could appease them. Have they figured it out now? Have they figured out whose side is on what now?
Gosh, I hope so. They could donate to Power of the Future rather than donate to these green groups. You can't get in bed with your enemy, and we talk a lot in this city in D.C. about coming together and reaching across the aisle, and that's all fine and dandy. But when your enemy wants to put you out of business, when your enemy wants to destroy you, there is no common ground. And the radical left wants to end the fossil fuel economy. They want it for themselves. They just don't want it for regular Americans. It's rich men north of Richmond personified in the energy space. And so, yeah, I hope these energy companies stop working with the eco-left, because the eco-left is not their friend and never will be their friend.
Well played, Daniel Turner. So to sum this up, hey, Exxon, donate to Power of the Future, not to Greenpeace. I think we got it. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Larry.
And God forbid the Sierra Club. There's more to come on O'Connor tonight. Keep it here at Salem News Channel. A lot of people lament that there's no good journalism going on anymore, no good investigative reporting, nothing's original. Well, I agree, and that's why I'm very proud to present to you something that was created by my colleagues at townhall.com, a story you won't see anywhere else. Take a look.
This ain't right. We had all this meat, we worked hard to get it in the freezer, process it, package it. The next day they came with a search warrant. Went through everything, house, every building in the barn. They just raided through everything. We can't touch it. We can't sell it. We can't feed our family. We can't give it away. Can't feed it to dogs. We can't do anything with it. They just took it to the dump. You have to keep going because people are depending on this stuff as their medicine. I want this world to have the opportunity of finding real food.
You're about to hear the story of how a small-town Amish farmer's world was turned upside down by the government of Virginia. Town Hall spoke with that cattle farmer, Samuel Fisher, the owner of Golden Valley Farms. Since the state raided his farm, Samuel has been criminally charged. His products, which feed about 500 customers and their families, were seized and hauled to the dump, and his meat sales have been shut down. Samuel and his family are Amish farmers. Out of respect for his religious tradition, we're adhering to his wishes to keep his face and family off camera as much as possible for this interview. This is Samuel's story in his own words. Can you just tell me more about Golden Valley Farms and its origin?
We started about 5 years ago. We bought the herd of cows with the business, with the customer base, basically just selling milk. We started doing cream, yogurt, other stuff because people were asking for it. And then along with that, we pretty soon started with meat. When we put up this building, we were not planning on processing meat ourselves. We were doing it a little bit for our family, but we were not planning to do it for our customers. And then we decided we're going to do some USDA inspected because I knew that is technically, to a lot of people's minds, is more legal. So I decided we're going to send it to the USDA facilities, have it slaughtered, butchered there, and bring it back, put it in the freezer and sell that. So now we had two options available. We did sell some of the USDA meat, but it was slow. It was very obvious the customers do want the meat that is processed here on the farm and no USDA inspection. And after a state was here, it was interesting. I told the office manager to do a survey from the customers if they want me to send our animals to USDA and have it USDA inspected, or if they want me to process it here myself. The survey came back around 92% of the customers wanted me to process here on the farm, sell it right here off the farm.
What are the costs to take it to the nearest facility, and how far away would that be?
That's around 2 hours of driving, and the cost to take it over there is a lot. It depends if you can do a lot at one time. If you can do a trailer load at one time, say 4 cows and 5 pigs or something like that, cost for all that would probably be $500. But it's hard for us to ship so many animals at one time, process all those, bring the meat back, and have that in stock. By the time the meat comes back, you might be running low on certain cuts of meat, but what you ordered from USDA was not accurate to that. You might run out of some stuff long before other stuff because you had to order it so far in advance. Plus then the pandemic came, and then you had to schedule your animals around 8 to 12 months ahead of time. Well, that was super hard to predict so far ahead how much I actually need to process. At that time, pandemic came, stores weren't open, stores were running out of food, customers were starting to buy heavily. All of a sudden, we had a lot of need for meat. Well, there was no option taking it to USDA facility, so that's when the trigger pushed to do it ourselves. Customers were buying mostly from our own meat, not so much from the USDA. Then the pandemic came and there was no other option but either not have it available or process it ourselves. So we started processing ourselves. We put addition to the building and made a processing room, and we certainly like it now. Then the state came in and asked what we're doing, and I told them exactly what we're doing. We're selling meat to our customers, and they said, no, there's no way around it. You can't do that. They asked permission to get in here. I did not give them permission to come in here, and they told me we'll be back and left. The next day they came with a search warrant.
So the customers loved it. It was great for the farmer. It was great for the community. It was great for the economy during the pandemic. And so, of course, the government ruined it. To get the rest of the story, go to townhall.com. Great job, Mia Cathell reporting, and Kevin McMahon, video journalist. That's it for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place. In the meantime, I'll see you on the radio.